Okay, good morning, everyone. We've been working with the English translations of the Bible, and last week, or not, last couple of weeks, we were looking at what translation did the church use from the early church up to present day, and we talked about Greek translation, the Latin translation, and just before the Reformation and during and after the Reformation, there was this call to have English translation, German translations of the Bible. People wanted to have access to read Bible. So that came about. And now we're just going to fast forward from King James all the way up to present day. We have a number of translations out there available to us. Joe threw out a figure the other day, a couple of weeks ago, that 70, about close to 70 English translations are available, and some are pretty close. It might be, well, we'll just leave it at that. There are a number. Now, if you go to a bookstore, you probably won't get all 70 or online. I mean, these are, Joe's done a lot of work on this, so he has a lot of the nitty gritty of it. But yeah, I mean, there aren't many Christian bookstores aren't open like they were. I mean, a lot of them have closed, but it used to be if you would go into a Christian bookstore, and I used to use this in a class like this, go to a salesperson and say, I want to buy a Bible. Okay. You want to buy, do you want a study Bible? You want a devotional Bible? You want, I don't know, family Bible? And then, we got the NIV here, the New International Version, because, I mean, when I do NIV, do you know what these acronyms mean? If you don't, raise your hand and we'll do it. But NIV is New International, and then the New RSV, and there's the NLT, New Living Translation. So you know the drill. And yeah, just admit her. Go.
I'm trying to get there.
Yeah, it's tricky. Okay, and got it. So I usually use that. It's very confusing, and I've had people here in the class say, "Well, I'm thinking of getting another Bible. Well, how do I do it?" And it's not the easiest question to answer for any of us to answer. So sometimes you just got to play around. I mean, you buy one and you read it or use it, and then, oh, well, I'm not sure about that, so you buy another one. But I think in the end, we come out with a pet translation or a translation that we like the most. But why is that? Is that because the church uses it, or the pastor uses it, or a friend uses it? So I always encourage you to have a couple translations. So then you can, if you come to a phrase you're not quite sure about, then you can see how another translation words that, especially if it's a phrase that's not easily understandable. I think that's by way of introduction, say something. Yeah. But so the handout you have in front of you is.
Hey, do you know if there are any denominations that say this is what you should use? This is the Bible.
The Primitive Baptist Church. The Primitive Baptist Church. I mean, and James only. Okay. We see a lot of this in Florida.
You know where that is. Never
Florida,
heard
yeah, who knows where
I've found a church in
Good, Donna, I'm glad you clarified for me.
Yeah, I don't know about denominations. I think because we have such an influx and in most denominations, there's somewhat of theological diversity. So like in the Church of the Brethren, for example, if you read Messenger or go to annual conference, a lot of the leaders are using the translation and New Revised Standard Version, now the updated edition. However, with, with Brethren Bible Revival Fellowship, which just was part of the Church of the Brethren. They would have used King James, and then, some, other people may have gravitated toward NIV. We have the New International Version in our Pew Bible, and one of the reasons we have that, I think, is because that's not necessarily a word for word translation. It's more of a thought for thought or a balance. So, and we'll talk more about the advantages and disadvantages of the different types. But, if someone gave up and did a Bible study at the annual conference, I would guess you would have a variety of translations. So for the Church of the Brethren, at least I haven't ever heard that you have to use this translation. But there are specifically churches within denominations, like a specific congregation might say, we're doing this. Like UPC, I think it's King James, right? So.
But they're not gonna say as a denomination,
Okay.
they're just gonna find, I think it's more like fundamentalists will lean toward King James.
Right. Yeah, and Joe can help me with this, but I'm finding some of the more evangelical churches. I thought at first, when the New International Version came out, evangelicals were going toward that, and some have gone to the New Living Translation, but I'm seeing a lot of evangelicals with some podcasts that I work with and whatever are using the ESV, English Standard Version.
That came about in the nineties, the group behind, NIV, talking about coming up with a new edition of it. And that they were going to, be more generous in how to translate the pronouns, make it more gender correct, that anthropos could mean both male and female, and so they were to translate anthropos as like brothers and sisters, or the
I'll
believers.
just stop you right there. What anthropos, what English word does that sound like?
Anthropology.
Anthropology. So it kind of means people, or could be man or mankind, but hey, keep going on that thought.
So there was a group of evangelicals that loved the NIV, very positive towards it, got very grumpy about that change. There was a pretty well-known name at Wheaton, that I can't think of his name right now.
But probably not.
But he wrote a lot about how to translate the gender-related
Yeah.
pronouns. They got together, and from the National Council of Churches, they got permission to take the Revised Standard Version and tweak it to their desire. So in 2001, this answer to where the NIV was headed in gender translation, they had their response immediately available, and that's the English Standard Version. So those evangelical groups that wanted to keep the traditional pronoun translation of man and make people understand that could be humanity in general, like I was taught in fourth grade. I remember the lesson that, well, man could mean, like your father or uncle, but it could also mean every human. And I just understood the context, but by the 80s even, the English department at Hershey High was treating man as gender exclusive. And this was going on in the 80s and teaching English in schools. And that's when schools, how do you translate the generic man versus a specific man?
And you'll see that in the translations, peace on earth, goodwill towards men. But some translations will say people or goodwill toward all. So that came about probably with the feminist movement, whatever, but the whole inclusive language movement, which I kind of buy into a little bit, because, anthropos you know, as I look at it, it does mean people, so, but you just have to do work on it. You know, if someone says mankind, usually they mean people, male and female, or men, women, and children, whatever, so. Star Trek. In their introduction, this is interesting. In 1966, when Star Trek came out, it said, what's the phrase I'm looking for? To go where no man has gone before. Then the Next Generation came out in the late 80s, 90s, and said, go where no one has gone before. And then when the next series came out, it went back to man. So, so you see, there's this, people are saying, well, man, he's everyone, but I say, well, now, wait a minute, if you mean, why not say one or people? So that's just an ongoing discussion that, you'll have.
It's not just a matter of preference among in that history, and I have a personal experience here with this. I have an uncle that was a pastor in the Church of the Brethren. And in the early 1950s, the Revised Standard Version came out. And he was upset because the word virgin was taken out and put in young woman. And he left the Church of the Brethren and split the congregation, went down the road and formed the Grace Brethren congregation. And this split families. He tried to get my mother to leave the Church of the Brethren. So the translations are more than just say, I prefer this. It has real consequences for relationships.
But it's too bad he just didn't go a little bit further, because in the passage I think he was referring to, it's a quotation from Isaiah 7:14. Which in the Hebrew says young women. And the Greek translation came along and translated it
I don't think that mattered to him.
as virgin. So originally, it really did mean young woman. But if it was a young woman, probably was a virgin. So, and that's probably why the Septuagint, or the Greek translation, translated it as virgin.
Well, there are other issues that went along with that.
Well,
it was translated by the National Council of Churches, and he was upset that the Church of the Brethren joined the National Council of Churches.
Yes,
And
and that's because the National Council of Churches, as Joe hinted about, I don't know if you picked up on it from what Joe said today and what I said last week, they have the copyright of the RSV, the new RSV, and the new RSV updated edition, UE. They have the copyright.
well, my Uncle Earl went to annual conference and made a real emotional
Yeah.
speech.
So if he didn't like the Revised Standard Version, and he might not like the National Council of Churches. And during that time, that was a hot potato, because my home church was, Reader's Digest. Is that still around? But they were writing articles about the National Council of Churches being involved in communism, or helping out. And so that was during the Cold War, and it was just a big deal. And my church, we had a few BRFers who were going to try to get us not to give money to the Church of the Brethren general offices because they supported the National Council of Churches. Well, we were lucky to have an interim pastor at that time. Does anyone know the name McKinley Kaufman? Senior.
Matt Kaufman?
Because Matt Kaufman was his son. He worked at the at New Windsor. He was
McKinley Kaufman.
McKinley Kaufman Senior.
Oh,
And
okay.
he was a really good pastor, and of course, he was in his 80s, pushing 90 at that time, but he got up. He was like E.F. Hutton. When remember that commercial? When when McKinley Kaufman spoke, you listened, because he had that command, even of everyone, whether you were, and he wasn't extremely liberal, but he was Church of the Brethren. He said, look, and he gave this good speech about the good work that the National Council of Churches did. So, so they backed down.
His son was in my class at Manchester.
Matt.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I mean, we can get into these discussions as they go, because translations are tricky. And especially when you're talking about the translation of the Bible, boy, and your friend or your uncle. Yeah, I mean, it meant a lot to him, and it got to the point that, you know, we're gonna lead churches over this.
He
So-
subscribed to something called Sword of the Lord.
Ah.
He's a Southern Baptist. Oh, no.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was scared I was going to hell. Yeah. It's the Lord.
All
I
right,
think what people need to recognize or be cognizant of is their translations. There's just, it's just another translation of the original writings. So you need to understand what's in the original writings, really, than there's just choices, they're translations, they're choices, they're not set in stone, this is it. My sister-in-law, who's very fundamentalist, came to our home and David was reading Hebrew. He does that upstairs in his office, and the guest room is upstairs. She heard him reading Hebrew. And she said, why do you read that? Why don't you read the original, the King James?
it's not the King James. Why is the Hebrew so important?
And what was the answer?
I think he didn't touch it.
I don't, did she ask me that question? Oh, okay.
But he
I thought she asked you that, yeah.
No.
Yeah, I touched it. I tried to explain that the Hebrew was prior to the King James, but you know, it just flew over.
Years.
Yeah, no, it just, I mean, when you're a grown up and when you were taught, I'm not gonna use the word brainwash, because that, I don't think that's the intentions, but when you just believe that, or people don't go further. See, this class, we're always trying to go further. We're always trying to, well, and someone will say, what about this? What about that? And so we spend time talking about it. But if you're part of a church that doesn't do that, then you're gonna stop it.
I think there's fear involved, that you grow up with that thought in mind, and if you deviate, you're fearful of what might happen to you, so you can dare go outside those boundaries.
That's right.
It's pretty scary to find out late in life that you've been wrong the whole time. That's sort of fear.
Very fearful. Well, and I think fear, Sharon, is involved in a lot of the hot button, hot potato issues. Say, you know, take modern issues or the sexuality issue that we kind of had a split over in 2017 with the Covenant Brethren and then other people just leaving, like Chickies and whoever. But I think there is a lot of fear, because we're challenging, we're not challenging, but changes can challenge tradition. And so, and I've had this happen to me when I was teaching at my first church at Oakton, and I was doing this Bible study on the Psalms, and I was talking about the Greek or the Hebrew in this case, and someone said, well, the King James, that does it for me. And it was an older person, and so you're going to find people, I mean, Joe and I and others, we're intrigued by all of this. I mean, it does get confusing, but you know, we get energized, you can tell, but some people, they just don't want to go. And my sister, who's, you know, fundamentalist, evangelical, she has told me this is too complicated, and the world is crazy enough. And I think I've told you this story or anecdote, that when she goes to church, she wants it to be neat and tidy. And I say she wants a box, gift wrapped with a bow on top. She doesn't want to get into textual transmission and this whole, how we got the Bible beyond the King James and she uses the ESV and, that's good for her. She likes that.
Well, basically, it was, you're being saved from the fires of hell. And that was, and saving was a big thing, that you had to go out and save people so they don't go to hell. This is pretty much the real basis of what salvation meant to him.
And that's fear.
But that's not historically Church of the Brethren.
Well,
Later.
It's a church of brethren pastor.
earlier and later, back in the twenties, we had a fundamentalist movement sweep through the Church of the Brethren. So, you had Dan West and all these people doing all these things, that led up to Heifer International and, so you had people at Elgin who were really active in doing things, but this, in the twenties, there was a fundamentalist movement.
1920s.
Yeah, the 1920s, there was a fundamentalist movement that swept through. And in fact, Dale Brown hits upon that in his book, because I know Dale used to come here. Another Way of Believing, it should be in our library. Maybe you guys have copies of it. But there will be a part in that book, and it's called The Brethren Card. Have you heard of the Brethren Card?
Oh, yeah.
That came out of the 1920s, and it was a way to try, because the Church of the Brethren, we don't have a systematic theology. Our theology has kind of been organic, fluid. But this fundamentalist Brethren Card just spelled it all out. No divorce, no this, no that. Just.
Was it a physical card?
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
yes.
That's another thing.
And it has revisions to it. There were revisions to it, so.
David, that's another thing my uncle did. He made sure that our Bibles all had that brethren card in the front of the Bible.
Yeah, and some of them are in directories. There was one in a directory, I think, Oakton or Friendship, so I waited and I eventually got it out there.
I think I've mentioned before, but Three Springs Church of the Brethren, which is the old church my ancestors I helped to form over in Perry County, clear up in the western end, Blaine.
Okay,
My cousin goes there. And well, so did her dad, her siblings. But anyhow, she said, well, they left the church because they wanted to stay with the way the brethren were.
Mhm.
And I didn't question her anymore.
Yeah.
Oh, Marie.
Or at what point?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, in an effort to bring this particular discussion about, is that brethren in the church, in our history, you can follow it. And Dale Brown, he's done a very good job in his book on Another Way of Believing, of tracing, what it is the brethren believe and what we have believed at different times. So that's a really good book on just theology and religious perspective in the Church of the Brethren. But a lot of brethren churches, we're not diverse necessarily from an ethnic standpoint, Church of the Brethren. We're pretty much white Anglo, but we have had some theological diversity over the ages. So, and in fact, the churches where I pastored and had good pastorates were churches that were theological diverse. You had basically A to Z. You had your conservative fundamentalists and you had your leading liberals, and then everyone else was somewhere in between, and it worked. And it was history, the community that brought them together, and then eventually it was love. And so they allowed, and both of these churches I'm talking about, and they're not the only ones, there's a lot of churches, brethren churches out there like that. But I just felt called to be in a church where there was this theological diversity as opposed to going to a church where everyone believes the same thing, so. So that's one way I can answer that, question. You just can't say, the brother believes this. Some people will say that, their particular brand of brother. And if you remember when Greg Lozakovich was here, because we have a reputation for being a fairly liberal congregation, but Greg would always remind us, look, you know, we have conservatives here too. Do you remember him saying that? No? But man,
I do,
he was very clear, you know, yes, maybe we're a liberal congregation, but, and I found that, you know, but we're, you know, the people who are maybe strongly conservative, or it made, it was very important to them in their church, those people would have gone. And you've seen that, right? You've seen people leave over issues over time, but, you know, we're not, yeah, we're not of one mind on all issues here.
I grew up in East Fairview,
Yes.
Church of the Brethren, and
Familiar.
there was definitely a fundamentalist element in that. My dad was a lay free minister, and that's all he had for a long time. And I can remember a couple members of the church coming to our house and really challenging him on things like the virgin birth and some of these
Cause he wasn't born.
because he was, yeah. And eventually, some of those families left and went to the Grace Brethren Church. Or they were more comfortable,
right.
but those were,
Yep.
weren't pleasant meetings, as I recall. I forget how old.
Oh,
I
they
was,
wouldn't have
but,
Especially when, you know, you have people going around the houses trying to say that you need to believe this, you need to believe that, and see, I'm talking about churches where I pastored, they may have had that at one time, but when I was there wasn't that. I mean, it was okay. And so this whole notion, we, agree to disagree. And that's the way it was at annual conference for many years at the time, and then that changed. And we remember, we were able to live with the 83 sexuality paper for a while, and then
Jim's dad was on that committee.
yeah, really,
And at that time, that was a pretty good paper because
it
he
was.
was liberal for that time.
yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
What was, okay, being raised Lutheran, what was the 83, whatever?
Well, in 1983,
Okay.
we came out with a paper, and work had been done prior to that, but it was in congregations. It was called the paper on human sexuality, but it was basically investing where the brethren, we were trying to come up with a unified version on where the brethren was on the human sexuality issue, basically regarding homosexuality. That was the real impetus. Now, in 79, the Church and Brethren came out with a paper on biblical authority. And the way they did that is they, on places where they couldn't agree, the committee, they divided it into columns. You remember this? And they divided it into columns where we couldn't agree. So the more conservatives were over here and the others were over here. And they tried that with the human sexuality paper, and the delegate body took it out. But they should have started all over, because if you read this 83 paper, which was reaffirmed in 2011, so it really should be the 2011 paper, the Grand Rapids, but we go back to the 83. Because they took the columns out, they weren't able to clean it all up. So in some places it's inclusive, in other places it's exclusive. And so people can, just like the Bible, people can go to that 83 paper and pick and choose. If they're more inclusive, you'll look at the more inclusive parts. If If you want to be more exclusive on this issue, you'll gravitate toward the exclusive.
Two
George, you've been
comments.
trying to get in there.
No, just a side note on Sharon's thing about fear. I'll never forget, we had revival meeting at South Amnell Church.
Yes.
And it was a 2-week thing. And I'll just never forget a pastor from West Virginia pounded on the altar up front and his false teeth flew out. And it went down the floor and he was in the middle of pounding and he stops, goes down, picks up, put his false teeth back in and went on pounding. No, but the fear that I felt at that point, I better get my life together pretty quick or I'm gonna lose my teeth.
That's, well, it was interesting, and I think Donna, you'll affirm this.
Samantha, when she went out to National Youth Conference and whoever that guy was saying, you killed Christ. She wrote me from National Youth Conference, I am out of this religion. I was not alive when he died. I mean, she literally took what he said and, you know, from that point on, Samantha to me is a very good person. She, as a nurse, she won all these Daisy Awards, which were the parents, you know, the family put her up. But you won't get her in an organized, that just really turned her off. And I think Donna, you had said you had some issues with that speaker.
Paul Monday.
Well,
David, what's interesting
I know,
is
Paul.
all our history comes together and we can move beyond our history, but that's our history. And so that still affects who we are even now.
well, it does. And I think Sharon, you hit upon it here, but it's just emotions. Intense emotions are hard. They're hard to regulate. And you know, Pat and I, we live together just as you married couples here do. And so when intense emotions surface in your relationship, that's, you know, that's where the rubber hits the road, you know?
Teeth fly out.
Yeah. Teeth start flying out.
That's when you go back to the traditional where the man is always right.
Exactly.
Amen, brother.
Fixing dinner, was it not, day before yesterday or yesterday? We were fixing to eat. And, he said, he made a comment. And I went from 0 to 60. And it just, I went, woohoo!
Yeah.
And then,
I hit a nerve.
David gives this look. And then he gave me that look and then I just tried to give it back. And then he was like, okay, you know, time out here. And we talked it out. And then we ate and then I said, you know, we didn't pray before, because we always pray before we eat. I said, we didn't pray before we ate. And then I said, oh, it's because we were fine. But I do want to say one comment.
Keep our dirty laundry at home.
This is the really tricky part. And I'm not talking to any particular person in this room. I'm talking to me. But because of my background, it's a little easier for me to work on this. But when we say we're tolerant and we believe in forbearance and tolerance, then it doesn't just go to one side, but it goes to both sides. I remember I was raised fundamentalist. My dad, in my young adult years, rejected all that. And he was like, tolerance, tolerance, tolerance. And then I said, Dad, you have become intolerant of the intolerant. Can you tolerate them? I had someone in this church approach me last Sunday about something and about my family and how they, you know, how they're difficult. It's difficult for me because there's, you know, and so this person said, look, your integrity, and it's about your integrity. And I said, but can I tolerate those who don't respect my integrity or who don't agree with me? So we have to remember, not only does the tolerance go to the left, it's gotta go to the right too. And that's where the rubber meets the road.
You know, we all have to be tolerant.
Both things.
And especially like, you know, our country's divided now.
Oh,
Politically, we all have to be careful. But anyway,
There was one thing when Sharon said about the fear thing that brought to mind, and I don't like that this has happened, but one of the things we found at our old church is that it was almost taboo to get an education because they were very worried about people being exposed to another way of thinking, and that would just change
that's right.
the, you know, or they maybe leave the church because they don't think the same anymore. It just spoiled the unity, I guess you could say.
David wouldn't have made it there, would he?
No.
In the Sunday school class.
No,
No.
my bad for not. Well, this goes back to the 1880s for the Church of the Brethren, where, we had a major split, and you had at the Church of the Brethren. We didn't acquire that name till 1908, so we were called the German Baptist Brethren. And then, we had a three-way split, but two ways. The old order went in one way because of that reason. They didn't want, there were several issues. Education was one, clothing was another, and not having carpeting in your household, all those things, because they were of the world. And it wasn't Amish, but similar. You look at why the Amish continue their way of being, and that's one reason they don't have education beyond the 8th grade, because, you know, you'll learn things, and that might mess you up. But the Progressive Brethren, which is really what now the Grace Brethren and Ashland Brethren are,
Progressive?
eventually became conservative. The Progressive Brethren, at that time, they split because education was big. They wanted salaried ministry and just all kinds of things. And so, and then the main group was the German Baptist Brethren, which then became Church of the Brethren, and they pretty much went with the Progressive Brethren eventually, but they took their time. But the Progressive Brethren, they were impatient at that time. They wanted all these things. In fact, I was talking with someone recently, that there were about 40 or so Brethren colleges at one point. New Windsor was Blue Ridge College. Does anyone know that? Do you remember Blue Ridge College?
I remember hearing.
And then there was Mount Morris College out in Illinois. So there, and I can't come up with all 30 or 40 or 50, but there was a time when we had a lot of Brethren colleges. And then when the smoke cleared, we had the 6 that we have. Elizabethtown, Juniata,
Manchester.
let me get the east ones first. Juniata, Bridgewater, E-Town, then you go to Manchester, McPherson. Was that 6?
Yes.
Okay. And then we have a seminary.
David, one of the things, I mean, I acquired, and it could be wrong, but Brethren, we had a department head of education was Brethren, I think, in Pennsylvania, was that right? Because I was always, maybe I'm wrong, but it was always that the Brethren were, why we didn't have Brethren elementary schools was because we believed in the public education and we more had it college level as opposed to the Mennonite at private schools.
And Martin Brumbaugh was the governor of Pennsylvania.
Okay, I knew he was.
Prior to being the governor of Pennsylvania, he was head of the education department in New Jersey.
Ah.
In New Jersey. Okay, well, you know, these discussions are important. As Donna said, you know, we have a history, it's our history. And yeah, we don't wanna get stuck in it, but we don't wanna forget it either.
We're all different histories.
Yes. Yeah, we did different families and we saw that. For those people of you who shared, you know, you have different experiences. We have an uncle here and I shared a few of my stories. So I think this is rich. So when I see these discussions, come about, I don't shut them down. Sometimes we go down rabbit holes and, you know, really don't lead anywhere. Now, and maybe this one, no, I think this one did. But, so, you know, that's my job to see that, you know, we stay on topic. But, you know, we didn't really get to the handout. We may start, and we got 15 minutes. But, I hope you felt as good about this discussion as I did.
So throwing a monkey wrench, so, and just continuing this discussion.
Okay, I tried to
So,
stop.
what do you do? Because I'm thinking
All
of,
right,
because I deal with this a lot on family.
you do.
So, want to be tolerant, loving, Christ-like, forgiving, other side. And so what do you do when you come to an impasse? And you talked about church splits. And in my case, I just very briefly, I found out this week that my nephew's not talking to me and I didn't know that. But,
He didn't tell you that?
I found out by trying to call him about a quilt. And then kept not returning my calls and blah, blah, blah. So then I found out that he's not talking to me and he's angry with me because of my politics. And so I need to love him and not hold resentment and still make this quilt and all this good stuff. But then what do you do when you come to an impasse? Churches split, families split, you leave churches, relationships split. And that's the farthest thing from Christ-like that I can imagine.
All right, Peggy.
I think back to one of the speakers at Elizabethtown College during their peace conference.
Yeah.
And Linda and Craig, we were always there, several of you. She was, I think, a representative from Maryland. And she was part of the Women's Caucus.
Oh, yeah.
And what she said was they did not focus on their differences. They focused on the things that were common, and they pushed that forward. And I think, you know, getting at yours, it's very difficult because I have the situation where my daughter-in-law doesn't hardly ever speaks to me. That I will still do stuff for her because that is the way I operate as opposed to the way she operates. But it's difficult because it does hurt.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the thing is it hurts us more than it hurts probably them.
This updates, no, don't worry about it. Yeah, so when you get at an impasse, there are things to do. You know, one thing is and this, I'll take this from Peggy's comments, you try to take the high road, if you can. Sometimes we're just not able to because how these intense emotions affect us or get in the way. It's not that intense emotions are wrong, they're not. Because if you're feeling something, you're feeling it. It's not necessarily right or wrong, it's just what you feel. But how you regulate that, how you deal with that is just so important. And I've had to learn that over the years. So when you get at an impasse, you're going to be dealing with intense emotions, as I've said earlier. So you just got to do the best you can. And sometimes, I hate to say this, but sometimes separation might be the best. That's not what we want, but you know, if you take the high road, you do the best you can, and then we have to. It's not necessary. You know, Pat and I talk about this a lot. What's more important, being right or the relationship? So. And then, you know, I'll just let you all answer that for yourself, but
And being right is a matter of perspective.
Exactly, yeah. So it's just, you know, this is tricky stuff.
Say what you just said.
Who, Donna?
No.
I said it's not a matter of being right, it's a matter of dealing a fact, or knowing what is the fact.
Say that louder so people can.
Facts are very important.
Yeah.
If you know a fact, you can be right. Somebody else cannot know that fact and not be right.
Right.
Then you have to find a diplomatic way to try to explain facts.
But if that person will buy the fact, what's more important? That they understand the fact or that you maintain a relationship?
But that fact may not be their reality.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think that
You can
That's where we are
maintain a
today.
friendship up to a point, but
But
I'm
then we-
disconnected with some people because they're so far out in left field with facts that
Right.
I just don't wanna talk to them as a friend.
But then, you know, well, I've used this phrase, figures don't lie,
But
facts don't lie, but liars can figure.
Yep.
So, you know, it's what we do with the facts and how we interpret the facts. And that's gotten so crazy. I'm not gonna get too political here, but for the last 12 years, that has been challenged. Fake news and, you know, what is the news anymore? And news has always been subjective, but that has really been dumped on its head during the last 12 years. I can say whatever I want. And I remember a poll, you know, about 8 years ago, where people didn't care if it was a lie, as long as it aligned with their belief system. So
Wow.
they didn't care, so then it gets really, and we see this with the Bible too, to bring us
Karen.
back a little bit.
Yeah, Karen Ungemach,
Yes, yeah.
shared, this is why I do my cookie videos.
Yes, I've seen
Even
that.
though they might be silly, which I don't think they are, it's something I can do. And then she said, let's send your nephew some cookies.
Yeah,
inside their quote.
thank you,
Sign the
Karen,
quote, yes.
thank you, Karen.
So, yeah. And you said that, Peggy, you said, you know, she doesn't talk to me a lot, but I still do things for
Good
her.
things, yeah,
Yeah.
Along with the kindness.
yeah.
Well, and that's modeling your behavior.
Sure.
Sometimes words really just are words. But actions
Yeah.
can model who you are.
And I've looked back at a few relationships. I had a falling out with someone in the church where I was in Baltimore because she was standing up and she was saying things during joys and concerns and during announcements that just really weren't appropriate. You probably know what I'm talking about or examples of that. And so it fell on me to talk to her, and it wasn't okay. So she stopped coming. Now, fortunately, I lived in the parsonage of that church. It was 2 blocks away, but I had to pass her house on the way. So for 6 months, I brought her twice weekly newspaper into the door, and once a week, I said twice a month. I think it was twice a week. And once a week, I brought her trash can in. And her husband, he could bring it in, but but I was, you know, they were night owls, so I was walking there to get it. And so 6 months later, one day I did that, and I got into the office, my phone rang. This is Ruth. Yeah, she was a very blunt kind of person. I'm coming over. We need to talk this out. So I said, come on over. And we did. And, you know, we just, it went up, and people were saying, come on, wow, why can't you and Dave? And so, you know, we just, and, you know, she was still Ruth. I mean, she would still get up, but it wasn't as bad as it was. But to go through all that, I mean, so I tried to kill her with kindness, and that was one case where it kind of worked out, but
Karen wants to speak.
Karen,
Yes, I agree that I think we just have to keep coming back with kindness with no matter what they do. And the thing that I keep thinking is Jesus never called us to be successful. He just called us to try.
You called it faithful.
Yes, and so if I just keep trying and keep doing the way what I'm supposed to do, whether they receive it or not is not my business. That's on them.
That's on that.
Yeah.
But we
Yeah,
need to be kind, yeah.
because we need to think of ourselves and our health. Because if we stay in a toxic state or a toxic relationship, that's gonna bring everybody down. It'll bring your family down, it'll bring you down, it'll bring the other person down. So at some point, and we're talking about the impasse, when we hit this impasse, then we have some decisions to make. And one of those is to back off a little bit, but try to take the high road, try to do kindness and whatever. Because, you know, when you get into discussions like this, a lot of people aren't going to change. They're not going to give. And so then the goal, and I think Karen hit this, our goal isn't to change them as much as we want. How many times did I get in a discussion with someone and if I could just say the right words, they would change their mind. They would believe, and it never happens. It just doesn't. And when you stop that, then you can do something. But you have to get out of that vicious cycle that I can change the person.
But there's a book, I don't know, I can't remember, but it starts with the dance of. And basically what it's saying is when you change your behavior or your reaction, that may change the other person's, but it has to start with you.
Yeah.
You can't expect the other one
Right.
to change until.
We have no control really over what other people do. We might have some, but in the long run, we don't. But we do control how we act, what we say, what we believe and all that. We have control over us. And I've done a lot of work with Murray Bowen family systems theory, and that may mean something to you, may not. But that is whole, his family relationship theory is all about that. When you're working with your family, you can't really change the other person, but you can monitor and change and regulate what you do.
Read Romans 12,
Romans
9 to
12.
the end of the chapter. It's excellent advice on all this.
Huh. What is that?
All about love.
Well,
It's all about
that's what
love.
we're saying. Don't repay evil for evil. Do what is good. If you feed your enemy and give them something to drink, it's like heaping coals of fire on their head. It's just a couple of things. It's all about forgiveness and doing good.
Okay, we're basically out of time, and again, this was a good discussion. If you take the handout home, bring it. If not, put it back on the pile or put it with your folder here in the office. We will get to this next week. And again, we want to look at the different types of translations that are out there, but this is interesting. Let's look back at what happened in the last hour. We were talking about how different translations come about. And then we really got under that and the emotions, because we had Ray's story about his uncle, and then Joe told the story about how the ESV came about because of the New International Version wanted to make changes to it, and the people in Christendom who followed that translation didn't like it, so they came up with another one. So there's stuff behind this. Now, we do want to look at some of this objectively and look at the different translations that are out there and what they mean. So that's where we're going to go. We don't want to come in and have this discussion every Sunday, although we could probably. But this has been a good session, and this has happened before in this class, and I want to thank each and every one of you for, doing this, because it's my honor to be part of a class like this, but we can share, I think there's a trust level here, we can share personal stories, and we know it'll be okay.
Hey, David, there's a need to share right now.
There
Yeah.
is, isn't there?
It feels cathartic to
Yes,
get some of it out.
yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, there's stuff going on, and even though this was history, and we try to keep us away from the current situation, but there's parallels.
We're living it.
Yeah, we're living it, so. All right, I'm gonna let us go and continue the discussion with me or with each other. Was it good?